Hello, I'm EJ Cox, and this is the Man in the Arena podcast. This week, we're going to be discussing, sort of as a continuation of last week, we'll be discussing what Marxism has to say about religion. It's something that we mentioned a little bit last week, and I'd like to just take a little bit here and sort of present you with some of the ideas that not only Marx had, but a number of the more notable communist leaders have had, or societies have had, about religion. So, to start off with, Marxism in and of itself as a philosophy depends upon a materialistic worldview. Everything centers around those who own the means of production, the bourgeoisie, and then the working class, the proletariat, and that the bourgeoisie will always maintain the means of production at the expense of the proletariat. And so therefore, basically all of existence is reduced down to those who have and those who do not have, and that to right this wrong, there must be a global revolution which removes the bourgeoisie, and that then the means of production are owned communally by everybody. Among many of the faults of communism as a theory, simply the fact that it relies upon human beings in the end to be honest with each other is a fault in and of itself. One Bible verse that I come to in thinking about this is Psalm 14, which was written for David, or by David for the director of music. And the first verse says this: "The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. Their deeds are vile. There is no one who does good." So we're getting into this idea that is common throughout Christian thought and Jewish thought to an extent as well, that human beings are by their nature evil. We see here, the Lord looks down, verse 2, the Lord looks down from heaven on all mankind to see if there are any who understand, any who seek God. But all have turned away, all have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. So communism relies on this idea that once the revolution has occurred, the proletariat masses who have been hitherto oppressed by the bourgeoisie will be able to come together and then share the means of production that they have seized from the bourgeoisie. This just doesn't work. And then again, when we talk about communism, anytime you look at where it's been applied, in fact, the opposite happens. They remove, for example, we talk about Tsarist Russia. And Tsarist Russia, of course, was not a good place to be. The Tsar ruled over everything, and you had the landed, oligarchy and everything that controlled all things at the expense of the poor and the peasants and the farmers. But then the communist revolution occurs, and they're essentially back in the same spot, where an arguably worse spot, where the party now decides literally everything for you. The party government decides where you work. The party government decides what you get to eat. The party government decides what you will believe in. I mean, it truly is like the book 1984 that George Orwell wrote. Any of these societies, we look at communist China, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, anywhere communism has been tried, this is what it turns into. A very few people truly controlling everything. And in terms of religion, communism needs to remove religion from the minds of the masses, because religion, of course, teaches that man is an individual who is ultimately accountable to God. Think back to, for example, one of our first episodes, which was on William Blackstone and the laws of nature. We look at William Blackstone, and he basically says that all laws in nature are written by God, and all laws that man writes are to be in league with what God has set down in the scriptures. Nothing should be suffered to contradict the law of God. That ultimately every man should be loyal to God above government. Well, communism needs to be the highest allegiance. the party has to be the highest allegiance for it to gain traction. And this is what Marx wrote in 1843 in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. And this sort of forms the basis for a lot of Marxian views on religion. He says, the foundation of irreligious criticism is that man makes religion, religion does not make man. Religion is indeed the self-consciousness and self-esteem of man who has either not yet won through to himself or has already lost himself again. But man is no abstract being squatting outside the world. Man is the world of man, state, society. This state and this society produce religion, which is an inverted consciousness of the world. It's very interesting whenever you read some of the stuff that religion is viewed as the inverted consciousness, not, communism, which sets man at the top and puts God not even at the bottom and just removes God entirely. And this is what he says. Religion is the general theory of this world, its encyclopedic compendium, its logic in popular form, its spiritual point d'honneur, its enthusiasm, its moral sanction, its solemn complement, and its universal basis of consolation and justification. It is the fantastic realization of the human essence as the human essence has not acquired any true reality. So again, we also get into an interesting argument here about that we haven't fully reached reality yet, that reality is yet to come, and ostensibly communism is going to bring that. He says the struggle against religion is therefore indirectly the struggle against that world whose spiritual aroma is religion. Religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. That is the very famous quote of Marx, that religion is the opium of the people. And on the one hand, the phrase has been rather demonized. I think what he's trying to get more so at is that religion is used to, in a medicinal way, numb the hurt of the real world. A lot of people have taken it, I think, a little bit out of context, but still, it's a negative view of religion. To try to say that this is a positive view of religion is, I think, idiotic, especially considering what we're going to talk about later when people have actually carried out his ideas. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusion. The criticism of religion is therefore in embryo the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo. Criticism has plucked the imaginary flowers on the chain, not in order that man shall continue to bear that chain without fantasy or consolation, but so that he shall throw off the chain and pluck the living flower. This, again, revolutionary type phrasing. The criticism of religion disillusions man, so that he will think, act, and fashion his reality like a man who has discarded his illusions and regained his senses, so that he will not move around himself, or so that he will move around himself as his own true son. And again, this is atheism in a nutshell. I have removed God and put myself in that place. I will determine for myself what is real. I will determine for myself what is right and wrong. Nobody will tell me what is right or wrong except for me and my true self. He says religion is the only illusory sun which revolves around man as long as he does not revolve around himself. So, again, very materialistic way of thinking, that man must revolve around himself, not God. Man must not focus on God. There is no higher ideals. There is no higher existence than this plane here. And this is communism. I mean, this is what it is in a nutshell. Vladimir Lenin, who of course is the famous Russian revolutionary who helped to start the revolution in Russia that brought about the end of the czars and brought in the United Soviet Socialist Republics. had this to say. He wrote, "Religion is the opium of the people. This saying of Marx is the cornerstone of the entire ideology of Marxism about religion. All modern religions and churches, all and of every kind of religious organizations are always considered by Marxism as the organs of bourgeoisie reaction used for the protection of the exploitation and stupefaction of the working class." So it's this idea that those that rule use religion as a way to stupefy you, the worker, into being obedient. Religion teaches you to respect those who are higher than you, respect authority, respect all of these types of things, and that we, as the good, the communist revolutionaries, we must overthrow this and bring the people to a status of being awake. It mirrors a lot of this phrasing we hear from the woke left here in America. You're awake, you're aware of what you've hitherto been asleep about. Your eyes have been opened to true reality and all these types of things. It's very interesting language. It gives one, I would say, almost a feeling of superiority if they believe these types of things. Here we have a quote from Joseph Stalin when he was the general secretary. In 1927, he stated this: "We carry on and will continue to carry on propaganda against religious prejudices. Our legislation guaranteed to citizens the right to adhere to any religion. This is a matter for the conscience of each individual. That is precisely why we carried out the separation of the church from the state. But in separating the church from the state and proclaiming religious liberty, we at the same time guaranteed the right of every citizen to combat by argument, by propaganda and agitation, any and all religion." So this is a very, I would say, deceptive statement of Stalin, because he's actually addressing a question from an American trade union delegate. And he is couching his words in phrases that we use here in America: the separation of church and state, religious liberty, all of these types of things. But listen to what he continues to say. "The party cannot be neutral towards religion." Well, in my mind, that just contradicts the separation of church and state. But he says the party cannot be neutral towards religion and does conduct anti-religious propaganda against all and every religious prejudice because it stands for science. So here we see, again, the juxtaposition of science and religion. Whereas, in my opinion, in a level-headed world, science and religion go hand in hand. As you learn more about God, as you try to draw closer to God, you will know more about science because God created the world. Again, William Blackstone, the laws of nature are written by God. They were set by God's hand. But here, again, with atheism, we have to set science against religion. And he says, while religious prejudices run counter to science, because all religion is something opposite to science. Cases such as recently occurred in America in which Darwinists were prosecuted in court cannot occur here because the party carries out a policy of the general defense of science. So in a way, science then becomes the religion of communism. And in science, the sense that atheistic science that seeks to disprove the existence of God, then therefore becomes sort of the religion of the atheistic communist state. The party cannot be neutral towards religious prejudices, he continued, and it will continue to carry on propaganda against these prejudices because this is one of the best means of undermining the influence of the reactionary clergy who support the exploiting classes and who preach submission to these classes. The party cannot be neutral towards the bearers of religious prejudices, towards the reactionary clergy who poison the minds of the toiling masses. Have we suppressed the reactionary clergy? Yes, we have. The unfortunate thing is that it has not been completely liquidated. And that is Stalin's little catchphrase for basically killing people. That, he liquidated his officers after he came to power. He liquidated a number of people within the army throughout the purges. In fact, the first 5-year plan, part of the large focus was on removing religion from Soviet life. He continues, anti-religious propaganda is a means by which the complete liquidation of the reactionary clergy must be brought about. Cases occur when certain members of the party hamper the complete development of anti-religious propaganda. If such members are expelled, it is a good thing because there is no room for such communists in the ranks of our party. So, again, folks that want to say that, well, communism just wants people to be equal and all this, communism has no care for people being equal. And I'll tell you why exactly with this statement. He here has stated that religion is used to keep the people stupefied, to keep the people poisoned, to keep the people under the ruling class. But never you mind that, especially, for example, when we get to the Second World War, because we've now had 20 years in Russia of this type of thinking and the associated Soviet republics, when it comes to, for example, the Battle of Stalingrad, the order is given not one step backwards. And I don't remember the exact number, but there's thousands of Soviet soldiers who are killed by their own officers because they are sent into these hopeless and pointless charges against the German soldiers. And as they retreat, they are shot because they betrayed the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, you as the individual do not matter. You do not count. Only the party counts, and at that, Comrade Stalin. So wherever this stuff gets tried, we ultimately come to where one man makes the decisions. We think about the USSR, Stalin is the biggest one that comes to mind. China, of course, Mao Zedong. We think about Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh, North Korea and the Kims, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un. Everything revolves around these people, these very few people at the top that keep you stupefied. I mean, look at North Korea. They're not allowed to have phones. They're not allowed to have access to the worldwide internet. They're not allowed to have access to electricity. They are kept in a state of ignorance about the rest of the world because it's dangerous to the ruling party if they become aware of everything the world has to offer. We have, for example, one of the things I find interesting is the anti-religious propaganda that Stalin's talking about. You have the cover of the Bezbozhnik Ushtanka magazine, which was the magazine of the Society of the Godless, is one of the groups under the Soviet Union. We have the Young Pioneers, the League of the Militant Godless, the Museums of Scientific Atheism, the Workers' Evening Universities of Atheism under the auspices of trade unions, and others. All forms of behavior and policies of the churches were treated in the official propaganda as insincere and aiming to overthrow communism, including both believers that were pro-Soviet and anti-Soviet. Even acts of loyalty by religious leaders to the system were considered to be insincere attempts to curry favor in order to retain their influence over the believers and protect religion from its final liquidation as the sworn enemy of the workers. There's an American Communist Party poster from probably 100 years ago, I think about, and it has a pyramid, and it's the pyramid of tyranny or something to that effect. And at the very top, you have the corporate bosses, and they're saying that we rule you. And then right underneath of them is a Catholic priest, a Protestant priest, and a rabbi, and they're saying we fool you. And that's all part of this propaganda, is that religion is used as a tool to keep the worker bound under the ruling class, as it were. The press would, in the Soviet Union, use slogans like, "Let us deal a crushing blow to religion," or "We must achieve liquidation of the church and complete liquidation of religious superstitions." Everywhere, religion is presented as superstitious and backwards. And they would often print pictures of completely destroyed churches or churches that have been used for or turned into other uses. So again, and then the Soviet Union, it does become the godless society. When I hear, as was discussed last week, this deconversion podcast and everything they had to say in regards to sort of communism and atheism and all these types of things, there's just a lack of heart with a lot of it. It becomes darkness. When you remove God from the society, it becomes dark. Now, I'm not saying, again, for example, in Tsarist Russia, the way that the church was sort of in bed with the czars, that was not positive, but the complete removal of the church was far more negative than what was occurring beforehand. Let's see, we have a couple other quotes here. It's just whenever I hear this topic of communism and religion being brought up, it makes me upset that people have such an ignorant view on communism. Again, those guys in the Deconversion podcast kept saying it was American propaganda to talk about godless communism. Communism is godless. That is, it's one of its sole points is that there cannot be a God. If there is a God, the entire thing gets thrown out because there's something higher than this world. There's something higher than the material comforts of this earth. There's something higher to strive to. There's something higher to be obedient to than your fellow man or the government. You are held accountable to somebody higher. And of course, we also have just the continued attacks on communism or of communism on religion throughout the world. I mean, part of the reason the Soviet Union goes into Afghanistan is to free them from their Islamic religion. Or we see the Chinese doing the same thing to the Uyghur Muslims. Mao Zedong famously said, "Religion is poison. It has two great defects. It undermines the race and retards the progress of the country." That progress is measured by how communism develops, not by how people are able to think or believe or move and act freely. Communism must be the end-all, be-all of all things. I've talked to numerous friends that either grew up in communist countries or whose parents grew up in communist countries, and every single one of them has said it was terrible. By any objective means, this lack of religion, this lack of everything, of any value of yourself above the material, it's poison. I cannot describe enough how bad it is for the people that have to suffer under it. I think of, for example, my old church. We had a missionary in China, and he would give us instructions. If you're going to message me, you can't say anything about church. You can't mention the Bible. Don't send me Bibles. Nothing, because if they go through people's mail. There's no security in your papers like we have here in this country. They go through your emails, and if they find anything that suggests that you are teaching outside of the communist authorized churches or Buddhist temples, they will come and they will arrest you, and you will be thrown in jail and prison without a trial, simply for trying to spread the word of God. There is no freedom under communism. I guess that's part of what I'm trying to get at as well, is there is no freedom under it. As many of these people in my generation that I don't know why they have rose-colored glasses about communism, it's killed literally tens of millions of people, for one. Under Stalin, roughly 20 million people died in the USSR. Under Mao Zedong, a conservative estimate is approximately 60 million. Every time they come into power, they try to take control of all the means of production, the farming, everything else, and it's managed absolutely inefficiently, so no crops get grown, no animals are raised, and people just starve to death. They come to power on these promises of making you eat better and live better, and then leave you dead. Yeon May Park, I believe is her name, if I'm remembering correctly. She escaped from North Korea, and she talked about what's one of the promises that Kim Il-sung rose to power on, that you will have beef and rice for every dinner. And the North Koreans are starving to death now. Then they starved to death for a very long time. It's the results speak for themselves. Cuba becomes communist. people die in droves. Fidel Castro executes thousands of people. These folks that are here in America that are crying for communism are extremely misinformed, and they are, I hate to say it, idealistic fools. They have grown up in the university system where the university has taught them that communism in theory is a good idea, and they believe that, well, if we just try it here our way, it will work. How many times do we have to do this and people die by the droves to realize this doesn't work? How many times do we have to try this and people's religious liberties get trampled upon to realize this doesn't work? How many times do we have to do this and the freedom of the press is removed and we have to learn this lesson over again? It's lunacy. It's absolute lunacy. Again, insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Communism will never work. Not saying even capitalism is the best system. There is no best system for government. Until Jesus Christ returns and institutes his millennial government, there will not be a perfect government. And even then, once Satan's released at the end of the 1,000 years of Christ's millennial government reign, what will happen? Satan will be able to deceive the minds of those men who lived under that, and they will rebel against God. Because man is by his nature evil and a rebellious spirit. And he will rebel against God when given the opportunity to. And I think back to a quote from Ronald Reagan, who famously called the USSR the evil empire. And he said, without God, there is no virtue, because there's no prompting of the conscience. Without God, we're mired in the material. That flat world tells us only what the senses perceive. Without God, there is a coarsening of the society. And without God, democracy will not and cannot long endure. If we ever forget that we're one nation under God, then we will be a nation gone under. And that's exactly what we have seen with communism. When you remove God from the national conscience, it becomes very easy for very wicked things to happen. I think, for example, of Lavrenti Beria. Beria was the head of I believe it was the NKVD under Stalin before the KGB comes up, and then he becomes the head of the KGB, the secret police. But anyways, Lavrenti Beria is estimated to have raped somewhere around 300 women and girls during his time as Stalin's head of information. And why is this allowed? It is the absence of God. You know, one example I think that's interesting to bring up is where is the deadliest place to live on the planet Earth in the last century? Anywhere in the area from Moscow to Berlin, in the eastern part of Europe. Between communism and then we have First World War, communism, and then the Second World War, wherein you have the atheistic communists, and then you have Nazism, which is being influenced by arguably satanic ideologues. You know, Himmler and Hitler and their value upon the Old Norse gods. We can get into that. Maybe we'll do that next week as a discussion on Nazi theology. But when you remove the Judeo-Christian value system, what you get is the wholesale slaughter of human beings. The abuse of human beings, the removal of the rights of the human being. When the leaders of a government realize that they have to be accountable to God, they at least tend to try to leave the individual alone, to realize that that individual is also under God and that their responsibility is under God to protect that individual. And I could go on and on this topic. I'm not going to do that to you all this week. But if you have any thoughts or comments, please put them in the comments section. Let me know what you think. Godspeed and live in liberty, my friends. Thank you.